I'm much pleased tonight to introduce the speaker of the day, Mr. Jacco Zwetsloot, our fellow counselor of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch, who is extremely talented in many areas. He describes himself Jack of all trades and master of some. And in the past year, he has worked as a business English teacher, translator, interpreter, simulation facilitator, corporate trainer, documentary cameraman and cataloger, cultural lecturer, souvenir evaluator, radio commentator, magazine writer, voice actor, researcher, copy editor, and tour guide. Is currently seeking a publisher interested in releasing translation of several North Korean comic books. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Korean Studies from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He has lived in Korea for over 12 years with his beautiful Korean wife. So today he's going to share with us with this interesting topic, the long-forgotten World War II prisoner of war camp in Korea. So without further ado, let's welcome Jacco with big rounds of applause.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. John, for that glowing introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you to all of you for turning out on this night. There are a lot of other things that you could be doing tonight. I thought of some myself, but this started basically a couple of years ago. I was having brunch on the Yongsan garrison with a couple of friends of mine who might be here today. Is Dan Ford here today? Dan and Roger Counts, are you also here? Make it? Okay. Well, we were talking, and Roger had heard that during World War II, the Allied prisoners of war, particularly American prisoners of war, were held perhaps in buildings on the Yongsan garrison. And so that's where the question began. Number one, were there actually Allied prisoners of war interned in Korea during World War II? And second mystery, if so, where were they actually held? So we start off with Yongsan. It's a good place to start. It was, before the Japanese border, Yongsan was the location of the public burial ground. So it was outside the city limits. Within the city, it was not legal to bury a dead body during the Chosun dynasty. So the area around Yongsan was an area where lots of non-Yangban, poorer bodies of poorer people were buried, those who couldn't buy plots up in the mountainside. And the Japanese bought it around the time of the Russo-Japanese War and built their own garrison there, which expanded to become the site of the Chosun Army garrison, the Japanese Chosun Army garrison until September 1945. Why September? Well, the war ended in August, but the Americans didn't arrive to receive the Japanese surrender until September. So basically, from 1905 until 1945, all that area there where the Yongsan garrison lies now was Japanese territory. And about a third of the buildings that still stand today on Yongsan, both on main post and on south post, actually date to the period when the Japanese were in control of Korea. So there's a lot of history there on the base. In fact, there's also a stockade, a military prison on the south coast, which has been there for over 100 years now. And that's an obvious place to start, but that's actually not where any Allied prisoners were held. I found out in my research, and thank heavens for the internet, because there's a lot of stuff online these days, that no prisoners were held on the actual military base. But it turns out quite close by. So, here, I'm skipping forward here. This is a table showing the Allied prisoners of war who were rescued by the American Army in September 1945. They're divided into three groups, British, Australian, and Americans. And they're divided into three camps. The main camp, Camp 1B, and Camp 1D. And there's a total across the bottom. So the total number of troops who were prisoners of war who were rescued in September 45 is 600, go back or forward, 680. Right? So it's 469 British, 71 Australian, including one Australian Red Cross representative. Not sure why the Japanese thought that was okay to intern him, but they did. and 140 Americans. Interestingly, that in Camp 1D, there were no Americans at all, and in the main camp, there were only 2 American officers, whereas in Camp 1B was very officer heavy, very top heavy, I should say, with 112 officers and only 26 enlisted. The WO here in British and Australia stands for Warrant Officer. Okay, so the original Japanese goal was to hold 2,000 white prisoners of war in Korea, and I make that point there, white, very specifically, because that was the reason that they were requested to be sent here in the very first place. Itagaki Seishiro was the commanding general of the Chosen Army. He was the highest Japanese military official in Korea at the outbreak of the Pacific War, and he sent a cable to the Deputy Minister of War, Kimura, in Japan. I'd like to read a little excerpt from that. On the 4th of March 1942, Vice Minister of War Kimura received a telegram from the Chief of Staff of the Korean Army, of which Itagaki was the commander, stating that, as it would be very effective in stamping out respect and admiration of the Korean people for Britain and America, and also in establishing in them a strong faith in victory, and as the Governor-General and the Army are both strongly desirous of it, we wish you would intern 1,000 British and 1,000 American prisoners of war in Korea. We wish you would give us special consideration regarding this matter. There was a specific request, and the problem was that Itagaki Seishiro wanted to break the positive bond that existed between Koreans and Westerns, a positive bond that had been forged since the early Western missionaries and educators and doctors arrived in Korea in the 1880s up until 1940. So Japan was fearful that Koreans had a very positive impression of Westerners and wanted to break that. So the main reason for bringing Westerners here in the first place was as a psychological tool. And the other problem was how to involve Koreans in the war effort, how to get them on side. So, this is the quote that I just read there. Now, the reply that he received was, and this is on the 5th of March 1942, so after the fall of Singapore, the reply received from Vice Minister of War Kimura was that 1,000 white prisoners of war would be sent from Southeast Asia to Korea forthwith. Going in the wrong direction. Okay, and the effects of that, and this is now written by, it's a quote supposedly said by a Korean onlooker, but then written in a report by the Chief of Staff of the Chosen Army. When we look at their frail and unsteady appearance, it is no wonder that they lost the Japanese force. This is supposedly said by a Korean upon looking at these soldiers walking through the streets. When I saw young Korean soldiers, members of the Imperial Army, guarding the prisoners, I shed tears of joy. So the conclusion made by the Chief of Staff writing this report was, as it seems as a whole, it seems that the idea was very successful in driving all admiration for the British out of the Koreans' minds and in driving into them an understanding of the situation. That was the main role of them being here. So the fall of Singapore then happened 15th of February 1942 at 5:15 in the afternoon. 80,000 British soldiers were captured. It was the largest surrender of British forces in history. 3,000 of them were interned at the famous Changi prison, and 50,000 in the British Army's Sellerang barracks. The rest, I don't know where. Then some of them were sent on what they called these hell ships. And hell ships were somewhat similar to the ships, but a modern industrial version thereof, of the ships used to bring slaves over from Africa to America. So it was, these were not passenger ships, these were made for cargo, and men were simply put in the holds there, and the hatches were kept on, and they were sent to wherever they were going to be taken to. So some of them were taken to the Siam-Burma Death Railroad, the Burma Railway, where many, many prisoners died. And some were taken to build the Sandakan airfield in North Borneo. And others were held in Singapore. The Fukai Maru, and this is the name of the Japanese ship, although the Australian prisoners of war gave it another nickname based on the spelling. I won't go into detail. 16th of August, 1942, so some months after the fall of Singapore, 1,000 prisoners boarded the Fukaimaro at Singapore Harbour. They were first put under the decks, and the hatches were put on, and they sat there in the sweltering summer heat. You can imagine it's August, and they sat there with the hatches on for 4 days, with the ship not moving, and not knowing what was going to happen. Then, on the 20th of August, they set sail from Singapore, and arrived in Takao Harbour, Formosa, which is now Taiwan, on the 29th of August. They spent 2 weeks there doing hard labour, loading the cargo holds with bauxite. Then they left again, wrong direction, on the 15th of September, and set sail. 22nd, they arrived in Busan, which was then known by the Japanese name of Fusan, with an F. So they were told to wait on the boats, on the ship, for a day and a half, and then eventually the 24th, they were disembarked, and they were forced marched through Busan, and then they were boarded onto trains. And on the 25th of September, they got off at Yongsan Station, where the iPark Mall and CGV are now, but they weren't there then. And they were marched once again through the streets and entered the POW camp. And so it was a journey. So it took, let's see, they left on the 16th, they arrived on the 25th. It took over a month to get to where they were going. This is a picture of the Fukaimaro. Right? During the journey, they were each allowed, I think, an hour or two on deck each time for exercise and for recreation, and then had to go back down again. Now, this is the front cover of a very slim book that I purchased on eBay a couple of years ago, called Sketches of a POW in Korea, by an Australian prisoner of war, J.D. Wilkinson. And this is a copy of another book, In Defence of Singapore, by POWs, T-O-Z-E. Those two authors I'm very grateful to, because actually they didn't really write a lot, but they're fantastic illustrators, and you will see their drawings during this presentation. They drew some very, very detailed pictures of the journey, the camps that they stayed at, and the work that they did. And so it's mostly thanks to them that we have any idea at all of what the camps and life in the camps were like. So here's a picture then from Wilkinson showing the the hold of the Fukaimaro. Almost 100 Australians and over 100 members of the Loyal North Lancashire Regiment were packed sardine fashion into this hold. When the hatch covers were on, the air quickly became thick and foul. There were rats, mice, cockroaches, and other insects to worry us. The journey then from Singapore to St. Jacques, then to Takao, where they loaded bauxite for 2 weeks, and then to Busan. This is the long journey they took from the middle of August to late September 1945. Korea at that time was known by the English romanization of the Japanese name Chosen. So in Busan, they were offloaded, they were fumigated, inspected, all their belongings were gone through by the Kempeitai, and anything that might be good was taken away from them. Then they were forced to march through the town in front of Koreans and Japanese onlookers, who were encouraged to curse them, mock them, spit at them. And then they were fed and they were loaded onto trains. And a little bit that I'd like to read for you. This is actually a testimony from one of the prisoners. At about 9 a.m., 1,000 British and Australian prisoners of war arrived at Busan in southern Korea from Singapore after a journey of 5 weeks in the Japanese transport Fukaimaro. As they disembarked, the prisoners were sprayed with disinfectant, photographed by Japanese pressmen, and then mustered on the wall for inspection of kit by the Kempeitai, that's the Japanese military police. During this inspection, watches, wedding and signet rings, and personal photographs were taken by the Kempeitai and never returned to their owners. After the search, all the prisoners, including those who were sick, were made to fall in columns of four, in 4 columns rather, and were marched around the streets of Busan between the martial serene inhabitants of the city, with a Japanese officer at the head of the column on horseback and Japanese guards on either side. The march went on all day under a hot sun, with only 2 halts in the playground of 2 schools, where the children were allowed to come close up to the prisoners to jeer and spit at them. So at 5 p.m., they then were, the men getting off the Fukaimaro, and then being marched through the streets of Busan. More marching. So this is Busan Station, And at Busan Station, they were fed a Japanese-style meal, and they were also given a Japanese-style bento or doshirak to take on the train with them, because the journey from Busan to Seoul would take almost 24 hours. So the next meal that they had was given to them at the station. This is the bento or the doshirak being handed out at the station. And this is on the train. On the train, they were forbidden to communicate or make any noise in any way by the guards. Now at Yongsan, once again, they got off at Yongsan Station. I don't know, I believe that they probably went direct from Busan to Yongsan without going to Seoul Station. Don't know that for sure. So at Yongsan Station, they were once again inspected, forced to march, entered the camp, and they were given a lecture by the camp commandant Noguchi. This is a picture of Yongsan Station, but I'm not sure. We don't think that it was the station at the time of 1942. It may have been an earlier one that was demolished and then had something else rebuilt in its place. It's a particularly nice station. I like to show the picture because it does look good. These are some Japanese officials who were there at the station to inspect and watch the soldiers, the prisoners as they went by. And this is an article taken from the Mail Shinbo, which was perhaps the only Korean language newspaper that was allowed to continue publishing in the Korean language throughout the period until 1945. It was run by the Japanese colonial authorities. And you see some photographs here of the men marching the streets, the Koreans on either side watching, and some officers standing by watching over them, and then walking down a set of steps. I'm not sure where that was taken. And then down the bottom we've got their goods being inspected or confiscated. Now, I've actually gone and translated this article because it is interesting. From the Mail Shinbo, September 26, 1942. Defeated British POWs arrive in Keijo. Keijo or Gyeongsang was the Japanese name for Seoul at that time. Big march to prison camp. After hundreds of years of invasion and brutal crimes of exploitation in East Asia, American and British troops, who are now quaking in their boots, fearful of divine retribution under the swords of the Imperial Army, have already been mopped up from the skies and soil of East Asia. Not only that, but as the first fruits of battle in the Great East Asian War, a group of British and American POWs have arrived on Chosun soil. A transport train carrying several thousand prisoners from the front in Malaya, to be interned at the Keijo prisoner of war camp, finally arrived at Yongsan Station on the 25th of this month at 12:07 p.m. After disembarking in Busan on the 24th and spending the night on the train, the POWs got off at Yongsan Station and were led by 2nd Lieutenant Terada from there through Samgachi, past the front of Yongsan Police Station to the prisoner of war camp. All the way, streets were lined with tens of thousands of people who knew well those who had once hidden their poisonous invaders' fangs behind masks and displayed arrogant attitudes towards even Chosun. Today, as they watched them, now prisoners of war, marching in lines through the streets, the crowds deeply felt their own noble status as loyal subjects of the Japanese Empire, and moral victors, holding the prisoners to account for the crimes of American and British invasions of East Asia. When the prisoners of war reached the exercise yard of the camp, the 1,000 or so prisoners were divided into 12 groups and arranged. Then Major Yada's decree was read out. The prisoners swore an oath, their possessions were inspected, and they entered the camp accommodation. From this day, they have been put to work for the construction of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The group of prisoners of war who had alighted at Yongsan Station marched to the city centre at 12:30 p.m. on this day. Under the strict watch of men of the Japanese Imperial Army and POW camp guards shining with glory, the prisoners set off on their march, sighing under the burden of big heavy packs on their shoulders. From the front of the station, the road leading to the electrified railway in Hangangtong was full of onlookers. The prisoners, walking towards the city centre, opened their eyes wide in surprise and emotion at the peacefulness and vitality of life here behind the guns, where even the shadow of war has not fallen. Meanwhile, crowds along the road were able to see before their own eyes the vanquished state of the prisoners transported from distant Malaya, and as subjects of the victor nation, they felt afresh the duty and proud status of leaders of the new construction of a greater East Asia. The steely determination that we must win and we must all be of one mind was engraved in each one's heart, and they felt thanks as subjects of the Japanese Empire and displayed the generosity of a great people. In this way, the group of POWs marched through Samgakji and Cheonggyeongkang, now called Chonpadong, for about 30 minutes until they entered the Gyeongsong POW camp. So I read the full text there just to give you a sense of the way that the Western prisoners were used as propaganda tools by the Japanese in Korea. Here's a drawing taken from Tozer's book of the prisoners being walked through the streets of Seoul with a Japanese prison guard on horseback. As I said, Camp Keijo, this is the Hanja for Keijo. That's the Japanese pronunciation. Korean is Gyeongsong. So formerly and now once again known as Seoul. So Keijo was the Japanese name for Seoul. This is a drawing of the front gate of Camp Keijo, where they were interned for the next 3 years. And here's a photograph taken from the same article that I just read the translation of the men actually walking through the streets, through the gates, very narrow gates, into the camp. And this is then from the other side, inside the camp. They're being led in by a Japanese officer in front, and then the Australian and British men behind. Here's a drawing of the #1 Japanese prisoner of war camp, Chosun, Keijo Chosen. You see it's a very large, the main building there was a very large 4-story building. Actually, this was an abandoned factory. The Iwakuma, or Iwakuna, I've forgotten the name, but it was a silk winding factory, where the silk was wound onto big spools. And here they are, the men being lined up and given their welcome lecture by Noguchi. Noguchi was, and here he was in charge of all the prison camps of Korea, and he gave them a speech basically telling them, look, Japan's, the rising nation, and our God has given us the power to win, and we're going to win this war, and you're here as vanquished subjects, but, we'll treat you not too badly as long as you behave yourselves. The full text of this speech in English has been preserved, and actually you can find it in some war museums. This is an aerial shot taken of the camp. You'll see this is the perimeter of the camp itself, the factory building of the silk factory, and the parade ground here with other buildings on either side. And Korean thatched roof houses around the outside perimeter of the camp. Here's an actual plan of what the camp looked like. This is the 4-story building that I was pointing out before. That's the perimeter. This is the tiny gate that they were walking through. You've got the kitchen here, bath, the store and the canteen. Very little to buy there, but they occasionally use it. The guards had their quarters here, married quarters for the guards, and the latrines were there. And there's also a hospital. Such as it is, I mean, the medical treatment for prisoners war obviously wasn't particularly good. This is a drawing of the inside of the barracks where the men were kept. And they were sleeping basically on straw mat, like a townie mats, on a slightly raised floor, and there was a burner in there to provide a minimum of heat during the winter. There's another picture of the same room. Now, this is how I imagine they would have walked. Yongsan Station is here, and this large grey area here, this is this is Yongsan Garrison. So at that time, the headquarters of the Japanese Chosen Army, what we today call South Post and Main Post. So the main road is here. The Japanese would have marched the prisoners through Samgakji intersection, up here, and then into the prison camp, which was right there, very close to Sungyeong Women's University subway station and Namyong subway station today. And then later on, I'll hand over to Matt to talk a little bit more about what that location is today. It's quite interesting. So while they were there, they were made to do some working parties. It was mainly some construction. Here, Isano Working Party was a party formed to construct the bed of a railroad running down to the river. I wonder if that's still there. It's an interesting question. Together with a number of spur tracks branching from it. This party finished as winter was coming on, mainly because of the extremely cold weather. The warehouse, the military warehouse, was the most permanent of our working parties. On arrival each morning, we were searched by the Gestapo. So-called, we had to go through the same indignity before returning to camp. But what's interesting, what I've read in the history of the United States Armed Forces in Korea, or POWs for short, is that a lot of these work parties were actually run by outside contractors, and they were popular in the sense that prisoners who were healthy enough would volunteer for this labor, because coming into contact with non-military contractors was the best way of getting outside sources of food or other goods. Knots, a very cold and unpleasant job in midwinter, was called knots. We had to untie knots in rice ropes and then sort the rope into bundles. Sounds like fun. Carrying grain, another warehouse job was the carrying of bags of grain from stacks into the mill for cleaning. The weight varied from about 66 pounds to 190 pounds, the latter being a type of millet. This is probably, I'm guessing, Namsan in the background. The farm, about 2 miles out, was the farm, a cavalry depot of the warehouse. Most of our jobs there were concerned with carrying or baling hay. Now here we have a picture which was described in Tozer's book, Tozer's book, as supposedly carrying hay opposite the former Russian legation. But what this is, and this is where Matt's eagle eye, Matthew Van Valkenburg, has helped me out a lot, it's more likely this building here, right, which was the second of 3 residences built by the Japanese for the Japanese Governor General of the Korean colony, and which stood on Yongsan Garrison. You can see Governor General's residence, and this is more or less where the 121 hospital now stands on the south coast of Yongsan. That building was unfortunately completely destroyed during the Korean War, so there's nothing left of it afterwards. So that's where the hospital was built. So it looks as if the prisoners were occasionally taken onto the Japanese military compound to do various kinds of labor there, and that would, I suppose, it would make sense given the close proximity of their camp to the Torsen garrison. Here is a picture of the Keijo railway station goods yards, where they were also made to load things onto trains. Keijo station, working on the freight platform at Keijo station, although entailing a good deal of heavy work, had its advantages. A proportion of the freight was foodstuffs, and, of course, the prisoners of war took their share of that. The sketch shows sugar being loaded into a truck. Note the POW getting his sugar behind the stack. As I said, these are jobs that were volunteered for by those who were healthy enough. Some of the crates we carried were very heavy and had to be carried long distances. We upset the Japs' calculations at times by changing destination labels. Sorry for the use of the word Japs. This is from the original book published by the prisoner. It's not my own interpolation. Kuruma, a certain amount of the goods were shifted from one part to another by railway handcarts, or kurumans. Timber trucks. We unloaded the many different types of freight, such as iron, flour, rice, and timber. This sketch shows prisoners of war unloading a truck of timber. You see here a Korean chige being used. And here's a picture that's actually labeled Korean coolie by the prisoner. The Japanese guard kindly offering some instructions and encouragement. Here's a picture taken in 1944, probably taken by the Japanese themselves as propaganda value to show how healthy and how fit the Commonwealth prisoners of war were. So here they are standing around a pile of what I believe to be moo, which labeled Taikon radishes in the in the original caption that we found in the Australian War Memorial website. Also, during the war, on at least 3 occasions, the Red Cross were allowed to visit the camps in Keijo and the second camp, the branch camp 1B, to make sure that things were okay. Of course, the prisoners were under duress by the Japanese not to give negative accounts of what was going on in the camps, but nevertheless, the Red Cross felt that things were okay there compared to other places. Now, not all the so we had 1,000 prisoners got on the ship Fukaimaru of Singapore, and as far as I know, they all got off at Fusan. I don't know if anyone died. I haven't found any record of anyone dying on the ship's journey. But not all of them stayed at the Keijo camp. About half of them broke off and went to Jinsen, to a second camp, straight away. They never stayed at the Keijo camp at all. They went to Jinsen. What's Jinsen? Here's the hancha for it. Those of you who could read it. What is it? Incheon, right. So Jinsen is the Japanese pronunciation of the hancha for Incheon. In fact, until Japan annexed Korea, Incheon was known as Gemoport, but Japan gave it this new name of Incheon, and it's still got that name to this day. Right, so this is the branch camp 1B. So it wasn't a completely separate camp in an administrative sense. It was, in fact, a branch of the Keijo camp. And it looked a bit like this. It had a stockade around it. And it was built on newly reclaimed land from the sea. This is actually a shot of Incheon looking from Observatory Hill, where MacArthur's statue now stands, looking down. This is probably, I'm guessing, the first Western-style hotel built in Incheon, the Daebutsu or Daewoo Hotel, and the prison camp was off a couple of kilometers here in this direction. So here's an aerial drawing of what the camp looked like. You had 4 major huts, cookhouse and bathhouse in the center, canteen and stores, and the Japanese were here. And this was the garden and baseball ground there. We have actually 2 different drawings by 2 different prisoners, almost identical, of the same camp. So we have a pretty good idea that this is a very accurate depiction. And of course, the ones who went down there in 1942, well, they stayed there for 3 years, so you can imagine they had a pretty good idea of what the camp looked like by the end. Now, false and true locations. The Americans took an aerial photograph in 1944 and outlined this area as the Jinsen POW camp, but in fact, the actual camp was here, quite a distance away. But, I mean, they had no active intel, no precise intel, so it's an easy mistake to make. They were, given the circumstances, pretty close. And as I said before, this whole area here was all land reclaimed from the sea during the 1930s and early 1940s. So it's all very, very new ground at the time. If you look at an old map of the 1930s of the area, you see that the sea, or the coast came right up to here and went up there. So it's all new area. Here's a map from the 1960s, American military map of Incheon. But what's this? The streets are given names: Alabama Street, Beatrice Street, 12th Street, US-based post office. So it was actually it was a lot of American military presence there until the 1960s. And here is again the area that we have identified as being the camp. And in fact, you see that 2 of those, if I go back, 2 of those huts appear to be still standing, as well as some of the Japanese barracks too, even in the early 1960s. Now, in September 1943, a new camp was opened. This is a second branch of the Keijo camp. And this is in Konan. Not Konan the Barbarian, but Konan branch camp 1D. It's actually, Hungnam is the Korean name. Right? Konan is the Japanese pronunciation of Hungnam. Japanese reading. Now there's the hancha for it. This is up in the far northeast. Okay, here's a 1930s map. The map actually made by the U.S. Army, so it's in English, but it's based on Japanese source maps at the time of the area of Hungnam. Now at that time, Hungnam had the largest industrial complex in all of Asia, certainly all of Asia, and certainly one of the top 5 large industrial complexes in the world. It was massive. It was absolutely massive. And the Japanese were making all sorts of things. So the camp was in this area here, just behind this mountain. It doesn't show up on this map because the map was based on source maps before the camp was opened in 1943. But the prisoners here were sent to work at this particular factory, making carbide. Now this is a picture of the main factory complex that I just pointed out on the overhead map there, right on the coast. It was huge. And there's some interesting theories about what was going on there that I'll mention a bit later on. Now here's a picture of the PW camp. You'll see the building is actually labelled PW. And it was a triangular shaped camp with some workers' buildings behind it and a small hill just over there. Here's another angle of the same camp, labelled here and here, so you can see from the air there was a prisoner of war camp, so it shouldn't be bombed. Now here's a drawing from Wilkinson's book. Wilkinson actually went to all 3 of the camps. So not only was he great at illustrating, but he also happened to be unlucky enough, I guess, to be transported around to all 3 camps, so he was able to get a good record of it. Because if it wasn't for this, we wouldn't have any kind of depiction of what it was like at all. So he said 230 men from Keijo and Jinsen formed this camp, traveling there in boxcars. The strength of the camp would later increase to about 350 men. The perimeter of the camp was roughly triangular. The camp was built on reclaimed land adjacent to a swamp. So this is also land that was reclaimed, not from the sea, it was Kukari land, but reclaimed from a swamp. You would have the cookhouse, the store, the bath, canteen, latrine. Pigs were kept. There was a hospital, another latrine, and Japanese were housed here. So who went to Koran? As I said, 230 men initially, although later increased to 350, from Keijo and Jinsen, and the main purpose was to work in the carbide factory. Right? There was almost no propaganda value in having them at Koran at all. It was purely labor. And there they worked 15-hour days, 7 days a week, in very hot conditions. Works parade. After the works bugle was blown in the morning, we went out on the parade ground and fell in by working parties. We were numbered and searched and then marched off to the factory for whom we worked, about a half-mile away. In the bitter winter weather, we found it very unpleasant standing 10 minutes or so with the snow on the ground and the icy blast whistling around us. And of course, we've had some cold days this winter. Well, northern Korean winters in the 1940s were absolutely shocking. We've read accounts of Korean War veterans who were there. It was not good. And don't forget, these are men who were captured at the fall of Singapore. It's a very warm climate, and so they've now gone up there. They've been handed some sort of warmer clothes by the Japanese guards. We don't know. They wouldn't have been very warm, obviously. So that just gives you some perspective. Yeah, so here's the camp, the Motomiya Chemical Camp, Chosen Chiso Hirokei, where they were making what they called carbide. Lime kilns. The lime party was one of the shift parties, working 3 8-hour shifts per day. Approximately 1 ton of lime had to be shoveled out of the kiln and broken up to fill each truck. 6 trucks was an average quota. You can imagine safety really wasn't a concern. Blacksmiths. Another shift party was the blacksmiths. Part of the carbide factory, the blacksmiths repaired equipment damaged in the running of the carbide furnaces and prepared new equipment. Furnaces. One of the hardest, hottest, most dangerous and most unpleasant jobs was stoking the carbide furnaces. These electric furnaces burnt at a temperature of approximately 3,000 degrees Celsius. Each furnace had 3 carbons and there were 4 furnaces. 3 men stoked the furnace for 20 minutes and spent 40 minutes recuperating. On an 8-hour shift, each man stoked 8 times. This was also shift work. Changing shift every 5 days, there were 2 12-hour shifts. Number 1 party. The work of number 1 party centered around the production of chisorondum, an abrasive similar to carborundum. The sketch shows one of the electric furnaces in which the product was made. And there's an interesting story that I found online in which one of the British engineers spent a lot of energy in successfully shutting down the furnace at least twice as a monkey wrenching technique to both slow down the work, but also to throw a spanner in the Japanese plans. Roller crusher. After the Chisorundum was broken up, it finally passed through roller crushers, which reduced it to the consistency of fine sand. 2 gangs of men worked an hour on and off on this crusher. So, what else went on at Corner? Well, there is a story about a Japanese atomic weapons program, which had been operating, well, initially the atomic weapons research had been taking place on the Japanese mainland, but in 1945 it had to be moved to Konan because the American bombing of Japanese mainland had intensified. And so in doing this move, in transporting the stuff to Konan, they say, the researchers say that they lost 3 months of time in their research, and ultimately they were never able to get a working atomic weapon. The Russians, the Soviets, took over all of Korea north of the 30th parallel, including Konan, and so whatever research and whatever scientists were there at the time fell into their hands. There's a book that's going to come out later this year called The Flight of the Hogwild by Bill Stryfer, an American author, and Irek Sabatov, a Russian author, who did the research into the Konan camp as well as the alleged atomic tests that took place there, and the interesting story of the Hogwild plane, which I'll mention later on. You can see a shadow of it here. It's the B-29 that was sent in to try to pick up the prisoners of war and bring them out and rescue them, but it was unsuccessful. I'll come back to it later on next time. Movements of POWs. So not all the POWs stayed at one camp the whole time while they were there. Some were sent to Mukden, which is now known as Shenyang, up in Manchuria, in the northeast of China. Some were sent to Japan, to Kobe, and to other places, other cities on the island of Kyushu to do work there. And we're moving around between the 3 camps, so from Seoul to from Keijo to Jinsen, Jinsen to Konan. So there's a lot of moving going around, and there's a few that died. More on that later on too. So here's a picture of the movements, and I'm grateful to Fran de Groen who put this graphic together. So from Jinsen, some were sent in late 1942 to Mukden, and then September 43 to Konan, and then some back down to Kyushu in Japan, and Kobe and Tokyo in 1943. So they weren't always there at the same place for the duration of the war. In fact, I have a number here in my notes. Actually, some statistics here. On 9th of November 1942, 100 Japan Party B prisoners of war, including 16 Australian infantry forces, joined 1,200 American prisoners of war who had been transported from the Philippines on a train, transporting them from Fusan to Mukden to man the large Mitsubishi Kokan heavy machinery factory situated there. In 1943, several large groups were shipped to Kobe in Japan and a new camp in northern Tosen at Konan. In 1944, 2 further drafts of prisoners went to coal mining camps on Kyushu, and in 1945 there was some shifting around of officers and men from Jinsen into Keijo, and the arrival at Jinsen of 150 US prisoners of war, mainly officers from Japan. By September 1945, there were just over 300 prisoners in Keijo and Jinsen, including the 150 recent arrivals from Japan. So Mukden, by the end of World War II, there were 1,700 men, American, Australian, and British, who were awaiting rescue. But they're outside my focus, because I'm mainly focusing on these 3 camps. So then come the Americans, and I mentioned them. So in 1942, in April and May, we had the fall of Bataan and the fall of Corregidor, and then the Bataan Death March, in which many American prisoners of war died. Those that survived, those who were lucky enough to survive the Bataan Death March, then ended up on hell ships. And some of those hell ships, unfortunately, were bombed by US planes and sunk because they weren't labeled as prisoners of war carrying ships, and so many men actually died in the ships when they were sunk. And then some of them were sent to Japan for imprisonment and forced labor. There were very few survivors. Give you an example. The Brazil Maru arrived in Japan with 581 living prisoners and 550 dead men. And the state of the living men who arrived was quite shocking, even to the Japanese doctors who were inspecting them upon arrival. 73 more men died within a month, and only 372 survived the war. Right? So there's so many tragic losses from between the fall of the Philippines and the end of the Second World War. Now, the US bombing of Japan, as it intensified in early 1945, the home islands, somebody made a decision, I don't know who, but somebody in Japan made a decision, let's move 150 US prisoners of war from Japan, mainly from the island of Kyushu, across to Korea. So in the spring of 1945, I don't have an exact date, they were shipped over to Busan and sent by rail to Jinsen camp, which is where they ended up, except for 2 of them who were sent to Seoul. There they were given light duties, mainly sewing, etc. They weren't sent out to do the heavy manual labour that the earlier prisoners had had. Now, the aftermath. 15th of August 1945, Japan surrenders. Well, the prisoners are still there. They're still in place. They're waiting to be rescued. In fact, initially, they're not even told. And at one point, they just suddenly notice that they're not being given the normal rations anymore, and that the Japanese seem to have left the lower-level Korean camp guards to take care of the camps. So, Operation Blacklist. This was a report that was written up in early 1945. It was a plan of occupation for Japan, Korea, and also northeastern China by the US forces. There's a copy of it I found online as a PDF file. Basic outline plan for blacklist operations. The version of the basic outline plan for blacklist operations to occupy Japan proper and Korea after surrender or collapse. And the version that I had was edition 3, 8th of August, so just a week before the war ended, 1945. It was originally top secret, but then downgraded to restricted by the end of 1945. Now this plan is massive, so hundreds of pages. But later on, towards the back of the plan, it has a number of annexes. And one of these annexes deals with where are the Allied prisoners of war. And this is an example of one of those pages. Obviously too small to read, so I typed it out. Right, Annex 5F, Appendix 2. And I won't read through all of it, but I'll just show you. There's a couple of pages here of camps. And thinking, hang on, there's only 3 of them. Well, they didn't know that at the time. When Blacklist was written, they actually had details of 12 camps, or coordinates of 12. 1 in Busan, 1 in Jinsen, 6 in Seoul, 1 in Konan, 1 in Seishin, which is now Chongjin in Hamgyeongbuk-do, Repo, which, judging by the coordinates, looks to be Pyongyang, and 1 in Gwangju. And then in brackets it says, show you, Gwangju, this is the Japanese name for Gwangju Goshu, possibly in Chungcheongnam-do or Hwanghae-do or in Cholanam prefectures. So really they weren't sure where it was. They had a vague idea of there being lots of camps, and in fact they thought there could be thousands of prisoners here. They really didn't have an accurate picture of how many there were. And this map was also in blacklist, so you can see there, Busan was highlighted, Gwangju is a black spot there, Seoul, Jinsen, and then here at Konan, and then further up at Chongjin. This is where they thought the camps were. And then here is, you've got Mukden up here in China. And these big black spots, they're not camps, they're just holes that are punched. Now, Operation Eagle. This is an interesting little sideline story because Operation Eagle was the first attempt made by the US military to get into contact with the prisoners of war here in Korea. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner for the CIA. Now, they were based in China. And there's a man there named Lieutenant Colonel Willis Byrd, who was the deputy chief of the OSS in China. He was operating under Bill Donovan and Lieutenant General Albert C. Wedemeyer, who were in charge of the China sphere of operations. And he said, look, let me get together a crew, I'll fly into Japan, and because they were actually preparing, working together with Koreans in the Korean Independence Army to start operations in Korea. This was all foiled because the atomic bombs had been dropped and Japan surrendered. So that was all scrapped, And the new plan was, let's go in there and let's rescue the prisoners of war. So, on the 16th of August, the very next day at 4:30 a.m. on a C-47 cargo plane, departs the city of Xi'an for Keijo, 19 Americans, 3 Koreans, and an Office of War Information reporter and photographer. Necessary, of course. Now, why is that? Well, here's a quote. Byrd, very publicly conscious and eager to gain fame by liberating Korea single-handedly, brought the reporter and photographer to the Eagle mission in violation of specific orders. That's written by Mao Chen-yu in OSS in China Prelude to the Cold War. So he really wanted to get some glory for himself while doing this mission. So they flew, and there was some false starts. They had to go back and get some repairs made, and then they left again. So finally, on the 18th of August, 11:56, just before noon, the C-47 landed in Keijo, and things got a little weird. Quite weird. I'll just give you some of the story here. The Japanese met them. They radioed their intentions to land 12 times before the Japanese said, yes, yes, we're expecting you, you'll get safe contact, come down. So they came down, and Byrd immediately explained the purpose of the mission and requested assistance from the Japanese in accomplishing it. Byrd said, I am here at the direction of Lieutenant General Albert C. Wedemeyer, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Forces in the China Theater, as an initial pre-Allied occupation representative to bring whatever help is needed to Allied prisoners of war to make preliminary arrangements for their future evacuation in accordance with the terms of the peace negotiations. Long sentence. Japanese officer says to him, then you are not here to negotiate a surrender? Byrd says, no. Our mission is purely humanitarian, to see that the prisoners are safe and to bring them what immediate help they need. Although the Japanese pledged to supply a report with the location of the POW camps, the number of Allied prisoners of war in Korea, and a breakdown by nationality, they later reneged on their promise. As the discussions dragged on throughout the day with evasive statements by the Japanese, Ihara, who was in charge, said his troops had received a ceasefire order from Tokyo, but that he had no authority to let anyone visit the prison camp. You must wait for orders from our government, Ihara said, and you must leave. It is not safe for you here. Great bureaucracy here. When Byrd asked to see the prisoners, the Japanese Airfield Commander's Chief of Staff assured him that the prisoners are all safe and well, and that we need have no concern for their welfare. When Byrd asked if the members of the Eagle mission could be temporarily interned, pending the formal signing of the surrender, the Japanese refused. Ihara insisted that they could not remain in Keijo since they had no official status, and the Japanese had no orders or instructions from their government regarding the Eagle mission or their position with respect to prisoners of war. Then we will need gasoline to get back to China, Byrd said. Ihara assured the C-47 crew that they would provide high-octane fuel for their return trip to China, where Byrd was to await for proper instructions from their government. When Colonel Byrd reminded the Japanese liaison officer that swift evacuation of the POWs was covered in the preliminary surrender negotiations, the Japanese brought up 2 tanks and set up their trench mortars. While the crew waited for the fuel to arrive, Colonel Shibuda and Major Hideo Ueda, a 29-year-old professional soldier and graduate of Japan Military Academy, entertained the Americans with bottles of Kirin beer and large amounts of sake. According to Lieberman, when Ueda asked for the name of the American Air Force song, the Americans let loose with a tumultuous chorus of Off We Go Into the Wild Blue Yonder, led by Captain John Waggoner, Air Transport Command, as Ueda beamed, beating out time on the table with his fingers. As soon as the Americans finished, Ueda began singing the Japanese Air Force song, Kubasa, or Fighting Wing. When the fuel failed to arrive, the Americans were permitted to remain at the airfield overnight. Later, without referring to the Office of Strategic Services or suggesting that the Mercy mission to Seoul was an intelligence operation, a syndicated story in the American press described Operation Eagle, the failed OSS mission to Korea, in this way. An Allied Mercy crew which landed at Keijo, Korea, in the midst of 50,000 Japanese soldiers, was alternately cursed, threatened, whined, and entertained before it took off again with 500 gallons of Japanese gasoline. And that's not the end of the weirdness. It gets weirder. So check out the full story. You can Google it. It's an article by Bill Stryker in American Intelligence Journal, Volume 30, Number 1, 2012. You can find it online as a PDF file and download it and read it. It's a great story. So the real rescue. So they had to wait a couple of weeks there. We had a false start on the 18th of August. On the 6th of September, finally, the Americans have by now occupied Japan proper and taken over the reins of government in Tokyo. And so they're able to send over some men from Japan to Seoul to take care of the matter. So, 6th of September, they land, they're led by Captain Stengel. They're taken to the Chosen Hotel, in the same location as the Western Chosen today, but a different building. And there, British Lieutenant Colonel Elrington, highest officer in Camp Casual, came and had dinner with them at the Chosen Hotel. I bet for him, it was the best meal he'd had in 3 years, no doubt. And he was able to tell them stories about life in the camps and what had gone on since they'd been brought there in September 1942. Colonel Yusuru Noguchi, this is him here, later on, this is much later, as he was being arrested and being escorted by an American MP, he was in charge of all POW camps in Korea. He came to meet the advance party at Chosen Hotel at 2000, and he finally gave them the list that he had promised earlier to Camp Eagle, to Willis Bird. He gave a list to the advance party of camps, prisoners, and who had died and what nationalities, etc. The 7th of September, the advance party visits Camp Keijo and Jinsen branch, and were able to inspect the camps. At Jinsen, the prisoners have made an American flag out of a parachute dropped by a B-29, and they're able to hold retreat the same evening. This is before sometime between Operation Eagle and the advance party arrived from Japan. Several planes had flown over and dropped relief supplies down, food and things. And in one case, in the Camp Jinsen, the large container, the parachute didn't work too well. The container actually crashed through the roof of the barracks, breaking the leg of one prisoner and seriously injuring a Japanese guard who stood there at the same time. So there's a lot going on. Now, again, going back to, this is the original spreadsheet that I showed you at the start. Camp Keijo, 158 prisoners in total at the end, largely British, some Australian, including the Australian Red Cross representative who was captured in Singapore, and 2 American officers. 168 men at the Jinsen camp, down from the original 500 that were moved there in September 1942. Largely American, 138. These are most of the ones that have been sent over from Japan in early 1945. And Kornan, 302 British, 52 Australian, and no Americans, except for the crew of the Hogwild, which I've mentioned before. I'll come back to them. So for a full total of 680 men. 8th of September, right, so the advance crew arrived on the 6th. On the 8th, the ships have arrived now from Japan. 24th Corps ships make harbour in Incheon. The recovery team arrives. 3 of these ships are now made available to evacuate the prisoners and any civilian internees who might want to be taken away. And there are some civilians who are interned here in Korea. Most of them choose to stay here, however. They're civilian foreigners, I mean. Then, by 1630, on that same day, all the prisoners of war from the Jinsen camp are loaded onto the hospital ship Refuge. First, the men who are too sick or injured to walk, they're carried on in litters, and then those who are healthy enough to walk up the gangplank. Then by the next day, the 9th of September, all the prisoners from the Keijo camp, the main camp here in Seoul, boarded Refuge by 1800. Now, what about the men from the corner? So here's a picture welcoming the American soldiers to Incheon. What's interesting is it looks like we have a Japanese flag crossed with an American flag, but here in the background I see definitely a Korean flag with the Union Jack as well, and the stars and stripes. So not sure, it's a bit of a mixed image, but certainly welcoming crowds there. You can see some smiling faces and raised hands in the month's edge here. So, Kornan was the problem. Why? Because north of the 30th parallel, this was the Soviet zone of occupation. Right? South of the 30th parallel was the Americans. But Kornan was well and truly in what is now North Korea. So the Soviets said, don't worry, we'll evacuate these men to Vladivostok. But they were slow in acting, and they didn't actually evacuate them at all. And so, ultimately, 3 B-29 superfortresses made aerial drops of supplies onto the Kornan camp. The third B-29, named the Hogwild, made a couple of loops around the camp. And there is a theory, again by Bill Stryker, who talks about the possibility of the Japanese having an atomic weapons plan, an atomic weapons project in place in Kornan. There is a theory that the third B-29 was actually taking photographs, aerial photographs, doing some recon, hence the circling. So ultimately, some Soviet fighters were scrambled. They shot the B-29, forced it down, and those men were captured. The crew of the Hogwild were captured and held there in the Kornan camp with the British and Australian prisoners. So they became the only Americans that ended up at the Kornan camp. There's the Hogwild, there's the crew. Luckily, none of them were killed or seriously injured. The crew was held for 2 weeks. The Soviets apologized when they realized the mix-up. Oh, yes, you're friendly, right, okay. We thought you were a Japanese plane. On the 20th, what later on happened was that Hogwild B-29 was taken and probably reverse engineered by the Soviets. Right? And that's how they got that piece of technology. The 21st of September, finally, some time after the Americans had arrived, the POWs and the Hogwild crew were sent to Seoul by train. And they ended up arriving in Jinsen. And here's the prisoners of the Kornan camp before their release. 22nd of September, they arrived in Seoul, or arrived in Incheon, I should say, in Jinsen, and they were loaded on the Mercy Hospital ship by 15:30. So that's all the prisoners finally out, all the remaining living prisoners, that is, finally out of Korea. Okay, here's a shot from Life magazine. You can see the watermark there in the bottom. Actually, some Life photographers came in with the probably with the advance party, and went to the Jinsen camp and took several photographs, which you can find online and access for free, which is wonderful. That Life put their whole archive of photos on the internet for free of the camp. So you can see there's some of the buildings. It looks like the men are now outside the stockade, I would say. And there's plane flying overhead. There's the Stars and Stripes. Here we are. This is inside the barracks where they were made to sleep, again, basically on mats on the floor. This is men outside, probably the Seoul camp, I believe. Outside the Incheon camp after they've been released. This is a Seoul, a bridge over the Han River in Seoul. These are men outside the Keijo camp, and you see again this massive building that even then it's still towered over the much smaller residences and wooden shacks in the area. Looking very happy, big victory. Okay, now there was a multiple grave for the prisoners who had died. There is a note that I've got to this slide that says that the artificial flower wreaths and the screen there were added by the Japanese for a propaganda effect to see, sort of show, look how much respect we're according the war dead during the war. So this is an article taken from a magazine called the Korea Graphic. Almost as soon as the Americans arrived here in September 1945, they began to produce an illustrated magazine for the troops of the 24th Corps in Seoul, and this was an article about the prisoner of war camp in the December issue of that Korea Graphic magazine. And it talks about what happened to the camp afterwards. Well, it was made into a church. This is a 4-story building, this library building. Part of it was made into a church, and part of it was handed over to a foundation that later on in 1946 established a school there. Right? And the Chongpa Presbyterian Church and the school coexisted in the building for a while, but ultimately the church left and the school stayed and kept the building. So now the issue of treatment of the prisoners of war. It was better than many other Japanese-run prisoner of war camps, particularly if you think of the situation in Southeast Asia. Of course, it was still no picnic. 10 men died on the journey from Busan to the camps, and 27 men in total died, most of them British. in the duration, in the 3 years from the first opening of the camp till their rescue in September 45. 27 of them died out of about 1,150 or so that cycled through the camps at one time or another. Itagaki Seishiro, he was, this is his mugshot, he was ultimately, it's a great irony of history, he was eventually sent to Singapore to lead the Japanese forces in Singapore and surrendered all Japanese forces in Southeast Asia to British Admiral Mountbatten in Singapore on the 12th of September 1945. So it's almost 3 years to the day from the time that the British and Australian troops first were sent to Korea at his request as a propaganda tool to break the bond between Koreans and Westerners and get the Koreans on side, and then he ends up being captured himself in Singapore and having to surrender to a British man. I'm sure the irony wasn't lost on him. And this is just 4 days after the release of the prisoners of war in Korea. He probably doesn't know any of that going on, but still, the fact that this happened, it's an irony of history. Now, there were many war crimes trials made against him, countless. One of them was that he requested 2,000 Allied prisoners of war be sent to Korea so they could be publicly humiliated for the purpose of improving civilian morale. That was one of the charges that was leveled against him. However, prosecution didn't enter any evidence because they felt that they had enough stuff on him for the other charges. So they kind of left this one behind as a not so important issue. Ultimately, he was found guilty of war crimes on 8 other major counts, and he was hanged on the 23rd of December 1948. What about Noguchi and the others, I hear you ask? Well, those found guilty of war crimes, and here's a list of them here, and their ranks, from colonel down to lance corporal. Now, Noguchi, who was in charge of all the camps, he was given 22 years of hard labor. But according to a Korean blog that I found that quotes a Japanese book written in the 1980s, Noguchi didn't serve out his 22 years and was in fact released not long after the signing of the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty. For the rest, we've got anywhere from 37 years. One was acquitted. One of the doctors there was given an account of a death penalty. And then we come to the location of the camps. This is where I'm going to hand over to Matt to briefly talk to you about how we actually found or refound these, how we went to journey of rediscovery. Go, Matt.
So, okay. So we already talked about the location of the camp in Incheon. This is a 1930 map, which basically shows that it was out in the water. That's now reclaimed land. You can sort of make out some of the buildings, not really, but anyways, today this is Shinguang Elementary School in Incheon, and that's the location in comparison to Incheon Station. And this was basically discovered on a blog by a dentist who lives in Incheon. It's called Incheon's Yesterday of Today. So he basically figured out where that was. One thing that was not known was where the camp in Keijo was. And what we did know, it was 1 mile from the train station. So we have this sort of radius around Yongsan Station. Then I looked up using the Naver Digital News Archive, which is a really wonderful resource, dna.naver.com. I found a 1965 Dona Ilbo article which said that it was located in Cheongpadong. So this is the modern outline of Cheongpadong. And this article from 1945 gave a couple of clues, one being that it was basically near a main street, and that if you soldiers look in the narrow alley-like entrance, not knowing that this was the main prison camp in the Keijo area. So that let us know that it was very close to probably this main street here. And usually properties like this, they tend to keep their shape over the years. Like, for example, there used to be an American military base in Yeongnam-po, and that still basically has the same outline. It's a factory now. So I figured either a factory, kind of unlikely, or a school. So Xinguang Girls Middle School seemed to be a likely candidate, especially when you look at the outline at the north. And then looking at this, I thought, well, it would be near.
This better?
Yeah.
Okay, that's much better.
Okay. So we thought this, I thought, well, it would be near where this building here is. And then when I looked a bit closer, I realized there were these columns. And then I used the
Down road view.
down road view, that's right. And then looking in here, you could see, here we have the same shape here, and then using this image from that 1945 article in the Korea graphic, we can see the same windows. So it seemed quite likely that this was the building. So a bit later, I tried to go in, but it was a Sunday, but Jacco had more luck going in a few days later. And
Yeah, could you take it? I went, any Aussies here today? I went on Anzac Day in 2011 and actually met with the principal of the school and found, much to my horror, that that building had been destroyed just the previous winter. So January 2011, that 4-story brick factory, which had been until then still used as part of the girls' school, was completely demolished to make way for a brand new building.
so they did give us a copy of a 60th anniversary of the school photo book, a photo album. So here's images. We have students in 1950, a kindergarten class in July 1946, a sports festival on the school grounds. They're spelling out the name of the school at the mass games on the sports day in 1948. That's another shot outside. I'm not sure, some of these buildings may be some of these, or they may not. It's kind of hard to tell. But the school staff sports festival in 1950, students on the street outside, and this was the first class to graduate in 1950, middle school girls, and here's their graduation on the 4th floor. And if we look at that room, here's so images from the 1945 article. Here's another sketch of the 4th floor, and we compare them. They look kind of similar.
So the ceiling.
Yeah, the ceiling especially, and these supports as well. Well, it's kind of hard to tell, but. And of course, during the Korean War, the school was basically moved to Busan, but by 1953 they had returned. And so here's a shot of the school in 1972, and you can just make out that old building. Also, this was the office that was used when it was a POW camp. And there's some shots of the office using the down road view. And so that's the office right there where they'd be walking in. Also, this was a stage where they held a Christmas pageant in 1942. And this may be the same room. You can actually see similar looking supports there. There's another shot of the building, all painted. And then, yes, it wasn't until you actually went that you could actually see that the building had been torn down.
Yeah, that's just the ghost image of the building that abutted it.
So that's what it looks like today. They've now built a new building, and that's a parking lot. And there's a few more shots of the ghost image of the building. Okay.
Okay, I think we ran out of time, but maybe two short questions.
So back there?
Thank you for an excellent presentation. This is a little bit uncomfortable question, but presumably a lot of the guards would have been Korean that were serving in the Imperial Army. And I'm just wondering if you would, your research, if you have any details about this.
Okay, good question. Okay.
I've read that a few Koreans, and I don't know where, were even found guilty of war crimes themselves. And I don't know if this would have had anything to do with camp.
Okay, yeah, to repeat the question is, what about Korean camp guards at the prison camps themselves? And certainly, yes, the lower level, the rank and file camp guards were indeed Koreans who were in the Imperial Army, although the commandants were always Japanese officers in this case, and the doctors as well. But and yes, it is true that in the Philippines and other Southeast Asian camps there were cases where Korean prison camp guards, and even in one case a camp commander was a Korean who were found guilty of war crimes trials for their treatment of prisoners. That was not the case in Korea. In fact, if you look at the list there, all the ones who were found guilty were Japanese names, and I looked at even the hanchak that came out in the original text that I read, and they didn't look like Japanized Korean names. What I have, and I don't have a lot of first-hand accounts, but a couple that I do have, there was one case where some Brits in the ginseng camp tried to escape the camp and make it through Korea into Vladivostok, and then somehow end up, with the Russians and get back to the West. And there was a Korean man working in the area who was familiar with their work detail, and he said, I hate the Japanese. I learned English from my Scottish Presbyterian missionary friend, and here's a map of the Korean Peninsula. So there's that, and there's a couple of other cases where I've seen some positive instances of interrelation between Koreans and the camp, the prisoners there. So it does seem to me that for whatever reason the screws weren't on as tight as they were in Southeast Asia here in Korea. Yeah.
One last question.
Mr. Neff?
Was there anybody else in the prisoner of war camps? Because I've talked to you before, and there was a gold miner that refused to be repatriated.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, the question, sorry, yes. The question was, were there non-military, were there civilian internees held in any of these camps? It's a good question, because they certainly don't get mentioned in the account. In the Husafik book that I've got, it does say that one of the missions there is to find and repatriate prisoners of war and find and repatriate civilian prisoners. Okay, so that's one of the missions. They do go through, in the Husafik book, a list of civilians that were in Korea in September 1945. It doesn't say where they were held. It just says these people did want to go back, these didn't want to go back. And there were some Swiss nuns, and there was an American gold miner whose name does escape me, but we have talked about it before, he was here as an independent businessman. He'd been captured by the Japanese, maybe he was under house arrest, I don't know, but he wasn't kept with the soldiers, that's for sure. And he decided not to go back in 1945, and he ended up being caught twice. He was caught by the North Koreans in 1950, and ended up dying in one of their prisoner of war camps. Bad luck for him, unfortunately. So, yeah, there were civilians, but not in the camps, not in the prisoner of war camps. They were elsewhere. Maybe in Sodom prison. Actually, I should mention, yes, there was a point that the rescuers, when they came to Korea in September 45, did go to visit Sodom prison and took photographs and copied prison records, because there was a time when at least some of the prisoners were held at Sodom prison, maybe for some kind of infraction. There's a mention of a court-martial, but it doesn't mention any executions happening there, so I don't have any more details than that.